Hey everybody, hope you're doing well today. This is Regan Edens, and we're having a little bit of technical difficulty, but we are welcoming you to CMC War Room 2, and we are here with a special guest, Armando Seay. I am going to jump out of the presentation. Oh, there we go. Okay. Hey Armando, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing as good as I can be, and if I wasn't, it's no use in complaining.
No.
So I won't.
I totally get that. Welcome to the CMC War Room. Today, we're going to talk about the impact of the National Cybersecurity Strategy 2023 on a defense industrial base, and then how that also impacts small, mid-sized businesses trying to the expectation of the impact of those requirements, and more specifically talking about the really the path forward on meeting CMMC and DFARS compliance requirements. So what we'll do is I want to give Armando a chance to talk about his background with MISI and talk about what the things that you've done. But prior to that, Armando, we want to take a moment to really genuinely appreciate our sponsors. And they've been able to really step up to be able to expand this conversation beyond the echo chamber that unfortunately we find on LinkedIn and some of the other CMMC and DFARS conferences. And so the idea here is to amplify this voice, to amplify the understanding of the strategic and the operational and technical impact of the requirements and that are happening outside of the ecosystem and in the ecosystem, so that people just have a much stronger sense of certainty, a confidence and clarity in understanding the requirements, both now and, of course, as we migrate into the future. We want to recognize QuickTrack and Virtue, which have stepped up and really partnered with us in reaching out to their customers, which they have fantastic products and services that they provide, and again, amplifying and expanding our voice. So let's start out with a couple admin things before we get to Armando. One is that on the 30th, Araglan will be with us talking about. Will be with us. Thank you. Will be with us talking about how they met requirements, folks. They are the only small mid-sized organization to have satisfied the requirements to qualify for CMMC certification. We expect later underneath the authority of the 7021 rule, or whatever that rule is numbered, later on this early summer. So they will be on the 30th, along with Jerry Leishman, to talk about how they navigated that path. You'll find Zbigniew very compelling, and his team really, I think that they have an incredible story. As they navigated that path, we were able to help them, DTC Global and myself and others, through our documentation set that we provided. So with that, March 30th, they'll be with us at 1 p.m., and they're going to take us through their journey. And I think that it will be very, very interesting. They did 24 months of preparation. They're supported by Texas MEP, known as TMAC, and of course our CMMC EPU documentation set. So with that, let's turn it over to Armando Seay. And Armando, tell us a little bit about MISI.
Yeah, but you know what? Before MISI, I'll tell you that I had a life before it, and hopefully I'll have a life in between and after it. I was a serial entrepreneur that was behind the creation of several Department of Defense contractors, primarily in the intelligence and defense community. And funny enough, when the CMMC rolled out, the first thing that I thought about was the CMMI. So any of you folks that are listening who have been around long enough, who remember the CMMI and how that rolled out and what impact that had on small businesses versus large businesses, we're kind of almost there again, really, in thinking about the impacts of and CMMI was the rage. It's still in place there, but you don't hear about it as much. So that was the capability maturity model integrated, as it was known back then. But for a minute there, a lot of civilian as well as DoD agencies were pushing that out as a requirement, that you had to have some sort of assessment and some level of of accomplishment within the CMMI. And based on whether you were CMMI 1 or 2, whatever, depended on what type of contract you had, particularly if you were doing software development and engineering, which a number of the firms that I was running or had acquired or was part of were all involved in. We were developing software. So I say all that to say is, I don't come to this without understanding small business and the survival and the overhead and the constant churn that happens in government policy and regulation. And those of you may have been around long enough as well, maybe you lived through sequestration, one of those, another small business, amazing challenges that impacted all businesses, but small businesses were hit really hard during the sequestration kind of thing that we were going through way back when. So again, all that to say is absolute background in small business contracting, defense contracting, intelligence community, work with the Pentagon, CIA, Drug Enforcement Agency, which is not DoD, obviously, but still intelligence related work, and did work overseas as well. So when we talk about ITAR and those kinds of things, I did work in Germany and Amsterdam and other regions in support of the military. So MISI was founded in around 2018 as a partnership intermediary. So partnership intermediaries is a US 32 Title 15 construct that allows the DoD or the government to award non-for-profits, which we are, a contract to do prototyping, academic engagement, and actually work with small businesses. So Title 15, the way it's written, is exclusive, has it within exclusivity of the type of businesses that we can work with, small businesses. Yes, we do work with large businesses because, you have AWS and Azure and things that, that are created by large businesses that small businesses have to utilize, of course. So that's the authorities that we operate under. So we act as a liaison for US Cyber Command, but also US Cyber Command partners, such as the National Security Agency, such as Special Operations Command, such as Air Force, on and on and on. So we work with all of those entities in the solving of cybersecurity related problems, whether it be defense industrial base, whether they be defensive, defense of the nation, whether it be space, rail, critical infrastructure, but also compliance related policies. So again, that ability, me being a small business entrepreneur, working with an organization as a director, co-founder, that focuses, right as it stands right now, on helping small businesses connect with the cybersecurity issues and matters of the United States Cyber Command and all of its partners in the Department of Defense, makes a complete circle around that whole small business thing. So we've been around since 2018. We're working on everything from zero trust, the zero trust NIST. The zero trust reference architecture was actually created and developed at Dreamport. Was one of the first efforts that we had. In fact, NSA still resides at Dreamport, working on the iterative process of prototyping additional aspects of the zero trust architecture. So been doing zero trust and being familiar with zero trust all the way back to 2018 from that perspective. We then entered into supporting the Pentagon under the prior administration, helping small businesses understand and get ready for the CMMC. We all remember Katie Arrington and all that. She had been in our facility, numerous times, and engaged with her at the Pentagon while she was, touting that in that position. So that's a little bit of my background and my connection to this topic of CMMC. I'll add that we work with a number of MEPs across the country, helping small defense manufacturers comply with existing regulations, but also get ready as they get the surveys and the questions and all that. So I'll stop there, Regan.
Yeah, listen, I mean, that's the reason why, we've been such great partners and friends so many years since we got to know each other, my time at the Cyber AB, because really, your depth and breadth of experience complements mine and complements this mission so well. And I think that you were a really great choice to really bring in and talk about the National Cybersecurity Strategy. And then sort of let's dive deep, and I'll go ahead and share my screen again. And I'm gonna first orient and make sure that everyone who's involved has a really strong understanding of the NCS 2023, and then that way we can sort of start where we are with regard to how does it impact the important things, right? How does it impact my small mid-sized business? How does it impact our ability to meet DFAR 7012 requirements right now. And then, of course, what impact is this going to continue to have as we move into third-party certification at DFAR 7012 using the CMMC certification model. So let's focus on the fundamentals. So on the National Cybersecurity Strategy, it was just released just a couple weeks ago. It has 5 principal pillars. And one is, of course, the defense of critical infrastructure. And critical infrastructure underneath Presidential Decision Directive 21 includes the defense industrial base. So that's a baseline understanding that the document has a one-to-one impact into your life as a defense prime contractor or subcontractor or lower tier subcontractor. So they're definitely navigating their way to a very aggressive disruption dismantle of the threat actors, which I'm very much appreciative of, having been in this space for quite some time now. The other third component is that they're going to continue to move forward and shape market forces. And when government shapes market forces, you can be sure that they're doing very specific things to drive security and resilience. And we're going to dive deep into that. We're going to touch on superficially the ability, and they're focused on building a resilient future. And then the international partnerships is also critical because remember, folks, at the end of the day, we live in a global supply chain. So this not only impacts us, these threats and vulnerabilities specific to the Department of Defense and the defense industrial base, but when we look at the overall defense supply chain, that includes tens of thousands of both subcontractors and the lower tier subcontractors within that space, and even foreign prime contractors as well. So the next thing that we're going to focus on are the highlights related to this, again, to baseline our understanding of some things that I pulled out in analysis of the NCS 2023 and the impact of very key points in relationship to our topic, which is that there is an aggressive move to expand regulation over critical sectors, which of course includes the defense industrial base, related to cybersecurity practices, focusing on both technology and cloud services. Now, one thing that will be very helpful to all of us is the fact that there is a concerted effort to harmonize the cybersecurity regulations and requirements across all the executive agencies so that you're not hit by disparity. Well, DHS requires me to do X and DoD requires me to do Y. And then NASA has a great CUI program emerging, and they require me to do something entirely different. So the baseline, of course, would be NIST 800-171 requirements. That's the baseline that we see within the DFARS contract clause 252, 204, 7012. But there are important differences right now, agency to agency. And what we want to do is harmonize those and minimize those. Then that way, small and mid-sized businesses that are meeting one set of requirements are very likely to meet the other agencies as well. And the subtle differences are maybe significant, but not impactful in terms of time and treasure spent to meet requirements. In the efforts to shape market forces, you had better be assured that the NCS 2023 emphasizes both punishment and incentives to drive security and resilience. And we're going to dive deep into that. So the expanded regulation here, okay, the expanded regulation here focuses on those critical cybersecurity practices related to technology and cloud services. And in a portion of a quote that I pulled out is that the critical select sectors rely on third-party services. And that's certainly impactful to both cloud services and managed services as well. We're going to talk about those different those details and the definitions related to those and how they begin to emerge both in the National Cybersecurity Strategy and also a recent piece of legislation that was signed into law by the president. So the cloud-based services are key here, as we all know, and that the NCS relates to that it's important to improve scale, and it's also important to improve resilience and to really commoditize the requirements to make them affordable and sustainable across the defense industrial base. But make no mistake that the administration, and this is a quote directly out of the NCS 2023, it says that the administration will identify the gaps in authorities to drive, meaning incentivize and punish, better cybersecurity practice in the cloud computing industry. So you're going to see that really a bridge out from the cloud service provider requirements underneath the D4 7012 contract clause, talking about FedRAMP moderate or equivalent, that is going to emerge as a very important and emphasized and enforced requirement across all the executive agencies with in support to the president's national cybersecurity strategy. So those third-party services, which are also critical to defense industrial base in meeting these requirements. So when we look at that, the president says that he's going to identify these, that he's going to work with industry and Congress and regulators to close those gaps. So that's in one way that's going to be very beneficial, and that the ambiguity and the uncertainty that has really been impactful to us here in the CMMC and DFARS ecosystem about a misunderstanding of the requirements or the misunderstanding about the expectations related to those requirements are going to become crystal clear. And I think kudos to the Department of Defense in that they have led the way. And I think if you read this in terms of the highlights that I pulled out, you will see that the president's strategy directly complements the Department of Defense's efforts since the deadline of December 31st of 2017 and for the implementation of DFAR 7012 and the emergence that we've seen of the CMC model as a third-party certification of those requirements, and of course the relationship to the supplier performance risk system and the scoring related to the DFAR 7012. So I see a convergence coming from that's directly reflected within the president's strategy. And a couple other things to highlight, and then we'll get some comments from Armando. So cloud service provider, very impactful, folks. So within this document, it calls out cloud service provider, and they're in the Cyber Incident Reporting and Critical Infrastructure Act, which corresponds directly to the National Cybersecurity Strategy. It defines cloud service provider in a definitive way, in the sense that they are citing what we hopefully should know, that a cloud service provider means an entity offering products and services related to cloud computing as defined in the NIST standard publication 800-145. And of course, the important piece is there that this amends any other superseding documents. Now, as we know, the relationship to the definition of cloud computing is in 145, but the description of the services that are provided by cloud service providers is in 146. And the relationship between you in the defense industrial base and our cloud service providers and the product and services that they offer us is in NIST 800, our NIST special publication 500-292. So what we see here in both the legislation that was recently signed into law in the National Cybersecurity Strategy is a convergence of these requirements, which is directly reflected in the relationship between NIST 800-145, 146, and 500-292. So that's important for you to take note of when you're navigating these requirements, either as a consultant or as a cloud service provider yourself, because you need to look into the services that may qualify as cloud services in 146, and that relationship that you will share with your defense industrial base customers that's described in 500-292 underneath the D4 7012 contract clause. Now, the managed service provider is also critically important. That there's been a lot of controversy for, and there honestly, that's based on the misunderstanding of this definition and the misunderstanding of the requirements in the D4 7012. So the managed service provider, for the first time underneath this legislation at the bottom, is called out, and again, it's reflected directly in the NCS 2023. So that definition underneath the Cyber Incident Reporting Critical Infrastructure Act of 2022 says that a managed service provider means an entity that delivers services such as network application, infrastructure, security services, and provides ongoing regular support and active administration on the premises of the customer at the data center of the entity or a third-party data center. So there's no ambiguity, no uncertainty about the role and the definition related to a managed service provider, and then the overlap of the services provided related to a cloud service provider that's described in those services in NIST 800, 145 and 146, and that relationship that's described in NIST Special Publication 500-292. So, as you've, Armando, as you've navigated, in Missy's effort to help small and mid-sized businesses meet these requirements, have you seen the emergence of the managed service provider that's really necessary for folks for most small businesses to really meet these requirements?
So I've seen a combination. I've actually seen a lot of managed service providers that we run into across the country that actually are not familiar with anything you just said when it comes to DFARS and CMMC. They're commercial managed service providers, and they have operated and continue to operate in a very traditional sense of providing cloud-based services to the small businesses, whether they be storage repositories, whether they be security vulnerability management, those kinds of things. But we have typically in our experience over the last 4 years and 4.5 years or so, is we're typically educating the contracted managed service provider on the DFARS and the CMMC, and they actually don't even, in many instances, even they just allow us to keep running, and they stand off to the side as we're telling them what needs to be done, right, and how they need to do things. With the smaller companies, we found in many instances that yes, that delta of understanding between the requirements, in terms of cloud versus managed service providers, that knowledge isn't there, just as it isn't with some of the small managed service providers around the country. Is it starting to change here in the last year or so? A little bit, even though, as you know, because of the delays and things that we've had, that also delays folks' attention, to what they need to do and how they need to prepare with these things. So, but managed service providers are, we see a lot of, particularly in the manufacturing sector, but also in the DoD, intellectual services, whether you're providing software development or architecture or whatever, they're using 100% of their infrastructure is in the cloud. Okay. So we're really talking about endpoints connecting to the cloud. That's where their accounting system, that's where their Word and Excel and other applications are all existing, and helping them understand that they still have to comply, and how do you prepare when you have a cloud-based service, to make that happen. So, Regan, hopefully that answered the question, for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, you're spot on. I mean, I think that I've seen that for sure, Armando, in the sense that managed service providers, even though that they're vigilant, of course, in providing secure products and services to their customers, the reality is that they really lack most of them lack a really strong understanding of the requirements. And so when they take a cursory look through NIST 171, if they know to, they're like, yeah, we do that. But of course, with DFARS 7012, the devil's in the details. And I don't think they have a clear understanding of the depth and breadth of those requirements, nor the investment related to, usually just a small portion of their overall client base. So
I would say I think both AWS and Microsoft have done a really good job of putting forth what, where the risks are relative to the business.
I would agree.
Relative to the controls that they inherit in use of their cloud architecture, right? So they, and I think they've done a really good job, and Microsoft is definitely heavily engaged, as you know, in this process, and they committed early on. In fact, I was teasing the folks at Microsoft a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about doing something together, where the last time we got together, we quote unquote broke the internet. I mean, it was such an incredible conversation.
Right.
That we have, we just had people just constantly asking questions. We went over, but anyway, Microsoft has also done a very, very good job of what they've been doing.
I agree. Yeah. And sort of bring it up a little bit, I want to also, in looking at the sort of based on your experience, because you, like me, has spent a lot of time in the trenches, both with clients and small and mid-sized businesses seeking to meet requirements and going through all.
As to some extent, a little bit of the government, and you've seen even there are challenges, right? As you and I have experienced recently, in terms of how to comply and how to implement when you're the government. Okay, when it comes to CUI protection.
Totally, it's confusing, it's difficult to navigate.
Yeah,
but I want to look at the other side of that coin. So you spent a lot of time with seniors there in the Department of Defense, and of course NSA as well. And so let's talk about their perspective on, do you feel like they have a sense of urgency and priority in understanding how they can better support the defense industrial base and really help do their part and helping organizations really navigate and understand the requirements?
I absolutely see the sense of urgency, but the sense of urgency doesn't equate to the same sense of speed when it comes to policy making and those kinds of things, whether it be DODI instructions, for policy related matters related to cyber, or related to how to implement, the vehicles or the constructs that allow us to implement policy, right, through various contracting vehicles. Those things don't unfortunately operate at the same speed, with the same urgency that our senior leaders have, whether it's NSA and the Rob Joyce and the Cyber Directorate and the work that they're doing there, whether it be the C3 organization, also located not that far from NSA, that deals with, defense cybercrime and those kinds of things, whether it be the folks at the Pentagon and the PMO, PFMO, those kinds of things. We all get it, whether it's the Zero Trust Office with Randy Resnick, who's been doing a great job when he was at NSA. Now he's at the Pentagon under Mr. Sherman. All of these things are coming together. I think, and Regan, you and I talk about this. Those of us that are transactional and I would say are permanent billets to this mission, we will continue the fight. But as we all know, we're headed towards presidential election. We're going to see dropout in senior leadership. I just had conversations today where, the next 3 to 4 months in terms of one particular senior leader versus another, whether they're going to be there or not, all of that's up in the air, particularly if they're military, right? As their terms come to an end or their rotations are happening, all that impacts all of this. But I think those of us who aren't at those levels and who live with this every day, we'll be there to continue to hold the torch and keep this going. We all know there could be changes depending on what happens in the presidential election that's upcoming, but we've all lived through those things. CMMC is still around, even though it transitioned from one administration to another. There were delays there. But the urgency, I wouldn't say just domestically within our leaders, but worldwide. As you know, Regan, because you and I know each other well, I deal with a lot of foreign senior military leaders and foreign senior military governments, whether it be the UK, the Australians, or even our prioritized partners in cyber, such as the Estonians, which are obviously NATO, or the Israelis, Singaporean government, with Indo-PACOM. This issue of the resilience of our defense industrial base is a global issue. Yes. Talking about the harmonization of these policies and these regulations, as Regan, you did an excellent job pointing out that there are already differences, whether it's if you take the examples of whether it's NASA, whether it's CISA, with their 5 pillars of zero trust, which flows into this topic in many respects, versus the Department of Defense's 7 pillars, why 5 versus 7? Why do we have to be different? Why can't we agree on something? But obviously the authorities are different, right? Which could cause these differences and may not make them as the alacrity that we need to get these harmonization done, right? Particularly as we approach a presidential election year.
Yeah, I agree. I want to point out to the folks that are listening and watching that if you look at the strategic objectives that I pulled out, now listen, the NCS is very well written. I was actually impressed by the document, but I'm, in our interest, Armando and myself, in our mission really to bring clarity and certainty to you to meet these requirements. These are the ones that I thought are very much most impactful to small and mid-sized business, to key constituents and stakeholders within the CMC and DFARS ecosystem. Because when you look at 3.1, and we're gonna look at that a little bit in depth here, because I think that is the most impactful. It says that we will hold the stewards of our data accountable. Now, in the 3.1, it's calling out privacy data and personal data, but most certainly as a strategic document, that's an example of the types of data that are going to be held accountable. Because remember that controlled and classified information has, privacy is just, and personal data, it constitutes just one of the categories, major categories, and there are 23 other categories.
Can I add on that particular topic? If we look at the financial industry, particularly not the current spat of bank failures, but we're talking like the credit card industry,
Sure.
or even some of the regulation around data security in the medical privacy. When you go see a doctor, you sign a bunch of different disclosures, right, about your privacy or the release of your medical information.
Sure.
That doesn't go as far as to say what the medical practice or the hospital is doing in terms of encryption or being resilient against ransomware. But when we look at the art of the deal, to use a term that could be controversial depending on what side of the fence you're on, it goes down to encryption as a core way to protect that asset. Because if you look at the cyber attacks, they're designed to either disrupt or to exfiltrate, right? And if they're designed to exfiltrate or hold your data in abeyance or to sell your data, if it's encrypted, you've mostly defeated that adversary's ability to make that data useful or have a monetary value for them. And that way, it also doesn't force you to pay any monetary recompense to the threat actor to get access to your data. But as you saw in the National Cybersecurity Strategy, we are running a race against China, Russia, Iran, and to some extent North Korea with the quantum race, and it's mentioned in the National Security Strategy. So if you look at any encryption methodology that we're currently using, is mathematically based. What is quantum? The promise of quantum is that it will destroy and eat, for lunch and breakfast and dinner, any mathematic algorithm that currently protects our data, which is why we're running a race. Secondary to that is post-quantum. What do we do if we don't win the race? How do we make our data, this is all about securing controlled unclassified information, right? Which is the premise of this. What do we do when if we don't win, number one? I'm confident we'll win that quantum race. But as quantum matures, how do we make the security of our nation and our critical infrastructure, our defense industrial base, more resilient against a quantum and a post-quantum era? So I just wanted to add that is a connector there. The other thing is critical infrastructures. CISA has, if I remember correctly, 17 critical infrastructure, and then within those critical infrastructure categories, there are critical infrastructure categories. Regan, you remember, and I remember meeting at the Pentagon when I was telling Katie and her whole team, hey, this CMMC thing we're heading in the right direction, it's kind of interesting, but guess what? At that time, they were prioritizing defense manufacturers, but guess what defense manufacturers utilize to manufacture products or to even turn on the lights in their facility? Critical infrastructure, operational technology. Absolutely. What does the National Defense Strategy, the Cybersecurity Strategy say? It talks about OT, operational technology, or sometimes in the Department of Defense, you'll hear it refer as control systems. You cannot manufacture a thing. We cannot do this webinar that we're doing would not be operational if the lights are out, the telecommunications infrastructure was out, right? And so on and so forth, because it's all reliant on critical infrastructure. So critical infrastructure and defense of the defense industrial base, as I like to say, starts in the parking lot and with the supply chain. It's related to rail. If you're doing weapon systems or you're manufacturing vaccines or you're manufacturing uniforms, you need the raw materials that comes in through trains, planes, and automobiles, as well as ships, maritime. That's all part of critical infrastructure. But at the core, we need to protect the defense industrial base from having its data exfiltrated or it being disrupted from cyber attacks. And I'll pause there.
And listen, I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, I think what you, to sort of summarize what you said is that everyone needs to understand that this is a journey and we're not turning back. There are milestones that we are going to have to move towards, or that lack of focus and that lack of determination to keep up with the threat in ourselves makes us vulnerable and makes it and quite literally makes it lethal. During my training webinars, I tell folks that this is the gravest threat in the history of our nation, bar none. And I wish that were hyperbole. But the reality,
and you see, our adversaries are not shy about telling us that they're coming for us. They're coming
absolutely
every day. The recent announcements, of satellites that will destroy our satellite constellations, or by exploding or crashing them. And there's so much of our manufacturing defense industrial base, our defense industrial base, that relies on sat communications. I don't believe the world knows how much we depend on satellites. And for driving our economy today, or maritime cyber, which is also depending on satellite. And we've seen the different derailments that are going on. But those hopefully are accidents. Right? But just look at those who are intentional. Okay, if through attacking positive train control, imagine what that does to the supply chain that fuels our defense industrial base. If you cannot get the raw materials to manufacture that drone or that bullet or that submarine or that, that next airplane, right? So when it comes to the defense industrial base, you have to secure your data. These policies, DFARS and the CMMC are well placed. But one of the things, Regan, and you and I have talked about this, is you also have to prioritize. I had the luxury of speaking and being a co-host for the Manufacturing Cybersecurity Conference in Chicago late last year. I listened to one manufacturer after another, many of them, some of them defense manufacturers with contracts with the DoD, talk about the impact of ransomware. These weren't large conglomerates. These weren't Toyota or Mercedes-Benz or whatever. These were companies you've never heard of in the various states that they operate on, who had been hit by ransomware attacks or attempts to exfiltrate data right off of their networks. Okay.
So since we last talked, Armando, I was
we both know Fernando, so I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Fernando because so awesome.
Yeah, he's awesome. Yeah.
He actually just texted me. The reality though is that I've got an example of that really in the last couple of days, Armando, that we spoke. I've got a little package here that's going to show the practical outcome that I have firsthand knowledge of just a few days ago that I can share.
So it's very important because it's not about your size, it's about what you do and whether you're just an opportunistic target. And as you know, the teams that I train that are typically NSA Centers of Academic Excellence students that have a cohort running right now, they've literally found keyloggers, they found persistent ransomware implants on the networks that are then being sold on the dark web saying, hey, I got persistence on this DoD supply chain company. They have a couple hundred employees. Give me a couple $1,000 and I'll give you the keys to get into that network so you can do what you want with them. So those are the kinds of things. I know you said you had a package. So I don't want to delay you.
Yeah. So when we're walking through this, I want to take the viewers through what the National Cybersecurity Strategy says, and then a practical example of just what happened a couple of days ago with ransomware, by the way, Armando.
Okay.
So when we look at 3.5 says is that we are going to leverage federal procurement to improve accountability. That's exactly what the DoD is doing with DFAR 7012, 7019, and 7020, and of course, third-party certification for DFAR 7012 underneath CMMC. And so when they talk about enforcement, when they talk about driving and shaping, be rest assured that the Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative by the DOJ, which has been active for the past couple of years since October 2021, has over, I think, $1.4 billion in damages and penalties that are not widely known. They're settled out of court, and so they are already doing this. And when the president published his strategy in just a couple weeks ago, he confirmed that the path that the DoD is already on, and we're going to show some couple practical examples from that. So when we look at supply chain compromise, which is defined underneath the cyber incident reporting for critical infrastructure, even though the Act says 2022 wasn't passed till just a few months ago. So that term supply chain compromise has a very specific definition: incident within the supply chain system that an adversary can leverage or does not leverage to jeopardize the confidentiality, the integrity, and availability of the information or the information systems which process or transmits. That language should be very familiar to everyone at any point during the life cycle. So this is a direct complement to where we already are within the defense industrial base with regard to controlled and classified information underneath DFAR 7012. So really the third-party certification, when we talk about that path that Armando described, is really an extension of what's the president's strategy and what the DoD is already doing. I want to also talk about the fact that the term cyber incident is clarified in the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act, in that it says previously cyber incident included any event that had imminently jeopardized, and they've rolled that back just a bit, but that it's related to actually jeopardizing the information and the information systems. So, but the term is extended though, because it includes within the definition of information, industrial control systems, exactly what Armando just stated. Supervisor controlled data acquisition systems, distributed control systems, and programmable logic systems, which are all relevant to critical infrastructure as we know it within energy, certainly, and also when we talk about IoT, and also when we talk about the core of manufacturing, which are PLC systems and those core instruments, which don't always have the protections of our other more sophisticated systems.
And Regan, those systems also apply to the very buildings that we do the IT work or the manufacturing processes of the defense supply chain within. So a lot of people don't realize as you walk around a facility, the health and safety systems, your elevator, your grid, your depending on what type of manufacturing, your exhaust fans, your redundant power, those are all reliant on OT and industrial control systems that communicate over a network. Some of the more famous compromises in school, I took a class with Harvard. They always teach about the target attack, that came into the HVAC system, and then promulgated itself onto the network that was processing credit cards and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to say that.
Well, listen, Armando, you hit right on, because that was actually the second bullet that I wanted to talk about, is that a disruption to the business or industrial operations is included within the definition and description of a substantial cyber incident attack. Right. So when you have when that definition is extended underneath the cyber incident reporting, and that would be included within the scope within DoD's and cyber incident reporting requirements.
So Regan, one of the interesting things when you look at the term supply chain, right? We've heard of supply chain attack, right? That has a definition. So here's a term that until probably recently had a term that we probably understood in common, but now when you use the word supply chain and you have a supply chain cyber attack, right? What does that mean versus the supply chain? I'll give you another thing. In fact, I just got an email from them. I won't name the agency, but there's a DoD entity putting together its supply chain process. You know where they're starting? At the procurement side. Who are the suppliers to me and to my contractors, and should they be trusted? So they're doing supply chain risk assessments using a number of tools that are out there, some of them well known, and that's where they're starting their supply chain aspect. And then you have your S-bomb, and then there's your other bomb. There's another bomb out there dealing with. But actually, it goes back to the software stack and that part of the supply chain. So I just wanted to add that, not to confuse people, because this aspect of it is a little bit more precise in what it's pursuing. But sometimes you will hear people use the term ubiquitously, but you have to put it in context sometimes.
Absolutely, and when to elaborate on that, when you're talking about as an improved description of what is a cyber incident, right? People ask me all of that when I'm on a webinar or at an event, or specifically when we're consulting. And so when you look at that it says specifically that it's unauthorized access, disruption of business or industrial systems and operations that facilitated through who? A cloud service provider, a managed service provider, or another third-party hosting or providing the data, and that is suffering supply chain compromise. So when we look at that and we look at the potential impacts on our ICS systems and our PLC systems within manufacturing environment, that cyber what constitutes underneath this particular legislation, what is a substantial cyber incident that triggers our reporting requirements. And now we know. Now, when a covered cyber incident underneath the definition is included, remember, it's 72 hours. And this legislation, it reinforces that. When a covered entity reasonably believes that a cyber incident has occurred. And that includes, by the way, within this legislation, ransom payments.
So Regan, one of the things that's really important is you can't defend what you can't see and what you don't know about. Right. So when you talk about supply chain, defense, industrial base security, one of the things we counsel folks on, like some of the manufacturers that I've worked with across the US and in Puerto Rico and so on and so forth, which is obviously part of the US, is when we're not really equipped to handle these calls, because that's not really what we're into, but we try to help, is when I'll get a call from a manufacturer saying, I just had someone, a foreigner, definitely sounded foreign, look foreigner. That doesn't mean that they're up to no good, but in this case, they were trying to sell me chips or motherboards or substrates that are, and then Armando, can you help me look at who the supplier is? And then, we're working with them. We'll do a quick check. And lo and behold, we find out that while this is not a sanctioned entity, they're a proxy potentially of a sanctioned entity or a rogue entity that's trying to sell manufacturing components that are already compromised. So when we go onto a network, even when they're working with an MSSP, and we start doing the scans, we're never shocked, but we see literally beaconing out to foreign countries right off out of either the IT shop or the manufacturing floor. Why? Because our manufacturing industrial base is heavily dependent on foreign countries, unfortunately. And whether it's a component and whether everything is assembled, well, when you put a PLC that's been manufactured or using chips that were manufactured overseas, and you put it on a defense supply chain network, and that thing immediately, minutes on net, starts beaconing out to a foreign country because it has a back door. If you don't know how to secure that, or you don't understand what the protocols are, you're vulnerable every day, all day.
Yeah, I agree with that. And when we look at the example that I wanted to bring up, and then because we had a little bit of technical details, we'll cover questions in overtime after the hour. The cyber incident and ransomware, when you see the conjoining of this in both the National Cybersecurity Strategy, the D4 7012, 7019, 7020, and of course, third-party certification with CMMC, and then this recent legislation in cyber incident reporting within the critical infrastructure, you can bring all of that together with an incident that just happened just a couple of days ago. And I've got very close knowledge about this incident where, basically a tier subcontractor was providing goods and services to SpaceX. They ended up getting hacked. They had put off their CMMC journey, and they were waiting till later on in this year. They're already supposed to be D4 7012 compliant, right? And lo and behold, the worst thing happens. They end up getting attacked. Their data is locked down. It's exfiltrated. The attacker not only just requires them to pay a $1 million penalty, but also they hold the data ransom itself and threaten to release over 3,000 documents related to SpaceX's products and services, for aerospace. Now,
and Regan, they could have done something really simple like encrypt their files.
100%.
Yes, the ransomware would have encrypted an already encrypted file, but what does that do to the ransomware threat actor? You have useless data, because unless you can decrypt my data, it doesn't. I'm just going to restore, myself, because you can't sell my data because you have no access to it using, commonly well-known compute capabilities available today, because you can't. So very, very simple, fundamental thing that we say, obviously also having an offsite repository, because what we have found, at least in the personal cases that I've worked, you get a ransomware hit, they restore, and they're restoring from an on-network repository backup files, and all you're doing is re-implanting the malware back onto your network, and boom, you get hit again. So, that whole principle that was invented, I think, by CrowdStrike of 3-2-1, three different types of backups, one of them not being on the network at all, so that you can restore yourself. So ransomware defense is really in the response to ransomware. I'm working on some things, and if anyone watches this later or now, I'm working on some technology where they say we can defend ransomware, we can stop ransomware. I have seen nothing yet that actually stops it. I've seen plenty of things that alert you to it. There are things that can detect the algorithm being, executing, and then they will alert you to it. It doesn't stop the ransomware, but it's a warning shot, right? Saying something weird is going on. Looks like it's a mathematical algorithm to encrypt. Maybe you want to start doing something about it. Another technology that has a chip, that if you put the chip on all of the computing hardware that you have, it basically captures the mathematical algorithm so that you can decrypt. Again, it doesn't stop ransomware, but it captures the algorithm so that now you have the decryption keys. So again, ransomware is still a pesky problem. It's one of the #1 things we see it still. All the companies that we've worked with, when they call the FBI or local law enforcement, look, God bless you. You're kind of not. You're going to get a little bit of help, but not much, because there's not a repository of keys for every different ransomware attack that exists, and there's a new one born or one being adapted every day, right, to come out and get you. And it's still one of the most opportunistic attacks that exist.
Well, I agree with you. And the companies being vigilant, this is a hardworking, really great subcontractor. They make stuff for rockets. They do
Right.
not do cybersecurity. And
Right.
what they have to do is they have to trust and recognize their vulnerability, their security vulnerabilities, their compliance requirements, and really focus their time and attention to get right, to mitigate their risk and vulnerability, to meet the DFAR 7012 and CMMC in preparation for CMMC. Because at the end of the day, you do not want to spend 4 hours on a call with eight, or nine SpaceX lawyers explaining why what you've been attesting to for the last 3 or 4 years
Right.
is not really true, right?
And so Reagan, you said several really important things. One of them is that you just described the bulk of the defense industrial base being small to medium sized. They're not experts in cybersecurity.
That's
and as
right.
you know, nor do they want to be. Like when you go to the doctor, you don't become a cancer expert. You just tell me what's wrong with me, give me the prescription to get well, right? And you follow those instructions, which is the CMMC, right? Now, it doesn't guarantee you won't get a recurring case of cancer. It's a very, dour description because there's nothing that's 100%. The CMMC will not guarantee that you will not be attacked, but at least you have resilience or to that, because there's something new being born every day that will take you out. But you're going to make the adversary's job a lot harder and maybe dissuade them from coming after you, right? Because as they start to probe and do reconnaissance on your network, they're starting to see the things that they can't get around, or that will get them that will alert you to their presence on the infiltration. And I'm going to tell you, this problem is not just defense industrial base. I won't get into the specifics of it, but our United States government has the same problem of keeping adversaries out of networks. And yes, zero trust and zero trust-based principles, identity management, a lot of things that small industrial base cannot afford, frankly. I met with a very well-heeled technology company a couple evenings ago here in Florida that's well backed, and their claim to fame is a multi-algorithm based way to protect your data so that your data is protected in flight, in transit, in storage. Even if it gets exfiltrated, it is perpetually encrypted with policy controls that doesn't allow the adversary to be able to make use of that data. And then you can potentially track that data when it goes on net, because the data has the DNA built into it. Many NSA architects have been working on that from an unclassified perspective in terms of data federation and data protection by putting the protection in the data, not in the network. So just remember what I said. The protection travels with the data, not with the network. So it doesn't matter where the data goes. It's got an inherent DNA to try to self-defend itself from unauthorized access and unauthorized use. But I'm sorry, I kind of squirreled on you a little bit, and I know we're a little bit over, so you want to go for questions.
Yeah. One particular question I think I should pull out is the fact that somebody asked you, am I saying that managed service providers in providing some products and services may qualify themselves as a cloud service provider underneath the definition of cloud service provider in 145 and 146 and 500-292? And the answer is that DoD policy right now does not distinguish categorically between a managed service provider underneath the DFARS clause and a cloud service provider.
Right.
What it does is it says that if you meet the definition, an organization that provides products and services that are related to those described in 146 and that are related to the examples and the relationship described in 500-292, then you are by definition a cloud service provider. So, DoD does have the opportunity to distinguish between those, but I think what you'll find is that the policy is going to be very consistent, that those organizations, no matter what they call themselves, when they process, store, transmit CUI, then they trigger the cloud service provider requirements underneath the DFAR 7012 clause. So, that is a challenge for managed service providers who are not yet ready nor prepared. Most of them are not prepared to meet the 171 requirements or to certify as required, as expected underneath the CMMC certification. But when we elevate those requirements to cloud service provider and FedRAMP monitor equivalent, that is an extraordinary height for most managed service providers to meet. So there is a challenge here. There is a lack of consistency in the application of the definition for sure. But what we know right now is that underneath DoD policy, it's very clear. If you qualify in your products and services, and a defense industrial based company who has to meet D4 7012 decides to use your services that meet the definition and the description underneath 145, 146, and 50292, then for the practical purposes of the requirements, you are a cloud service provider. So that will be, I think, very consistent. But the DoD CIO and certainly DoD at large can distinguish, give further clarification in a policy which hasn't yet, we haven't seen yet, about cloud service providers requirements and about the cloud service provider requirements for FedRAMP moderate or equivalent, and how they relate to the appropriate standards and references. So with that, I don't want to go too much over. I genuinely appreciate people navigating their way through the bumps and bruises. We will provide this webinar out publicly. We'll shape it up just a little bit and send it out. And so all of those folks that registered that may have had trouble getting in will be able to access that pre-recorded webinar. And listen, Armando, you are outstanding as always. Your depth and breadth of knowledge is critical and important to the advice and counsel, wise counsel that you provide DoD seniors, and the services that Missy provides, both the private sector and government sector, in fulfilling its mission. So I genuinely appreciate you, and really look forward to our next hack the whatever session. What do you got coming in?
So in September 18th to the 22nd,
Okay.
Ridge, Illinois, hack the building hospital edition with NSA and academia and industry. We'll be decamping right outside downtown Chicago for that event. Again, critical infrastructure, data privacy will be, whether it's healthcare related or CMMC, all of those things will be topics. We'll be, curating speakers and panels on. And so looking forward for a very exciting event there in right outside downtown Chicago in September.
Outstanding. Well, I genuinely appreciate you, and I appreciate what Missy brings to the fight. I want to remind everyone that on May 1st, General Petraeus will be with us to talk about defense supply chain vulnerability and its impact on operational readiness. So he is a mentor of mine and has been for quite some time, and I've supported him both directly and indirectly over the past 20 years of my life in Afghanistan. And I'm very appreciative of his time and attention. And also we have if you want to know more about the depth and breadth of requirements, some of the things that we talked about from the technical aspects, I am executing a CMMC certified professional course on April 10th through the 13th through our partner, Southern Methodist University. So we welcome you, if regardless of whether you think that you're going to be an assessor or whether you're doing it for purposes of to support your own company or providing consulting services to help organizations navigate their way through the requirements. So we are grateful to everyone for their time and attention. And we just want to remind you that together we can secure America's defense supply chain. So we thank you, Armando, for your time and attention. And we look forward to our next CMMC War Room sometime later this month. Have a great day.